All right, welcome everyone to our PulumiUP panel on AI for cloud development. I'm honored today to be joined by an amazing group of panelists here. We've got technologists working kind of at the forefront of applying AI to cloud developer tooling from many really exciting companies working on many exciting products. So I'd like to welcome Claire Liguri from AWS, Giri Srinivas from Docker, Philip Carter from Honeycomb, and my colleague Megan Kojikar from Pulumi. Welcome everyone.
Hello.
Thanks.
Great to have you all here. So maybe to get things started, would love to just ask each of you to introduce yourself, talk about kind of what you're working on right now, and kind of how you originally got into working on building tools for cloud development. Maybe Giri, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Giri Srinivas, lead product at Docker, and I started on cloud development tools mostly as a consumer of them about 14 years ago, building first SaaS product. Which was for a startup that I had started with my co-founder. Since then, have been involved with cloud security for the most part, and then shifting a little bit to more generic like cloud development. I think the most recent iteration, with joining Docker about a year and a half ago. So really excited to see like the how the space has evolved, and I think there's a natural confluence with what we're seeing both in cloud native development and opportunities around Gen AI. So we're excited about that here at Docker and looking forward to the conversation around this.
Wonderful. And maybe Claire.
Yeah, I'm Claire. I'm a senior principal engineer at AWS. I've been here for 10 years now. And before I came to AWS, I'd never worked on developer tools. And in fact, when I was interviewing for my job at AWS, they couldn't tell me what the team was going to be because it was a new product that they were working on. And that turned out to be AWS Code Commit. So I kind of lucked into working on developer tools 10 years ago. And since then, I've really focused on developer tools, working on the AWS Code Suite, and then working on tools for containers and serverless and infrastructure as code. And now I work on Amazon Q Developer. So I get to combine kind of that love of developer tools and serving developers with the power of generative AI.
Wonderful. I'm sure we'll have lots more to talk about around that in a second. Philip, how about yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Philip Carter. I have only been in cloud development, I guess, arguably for about 3 years. Worked on developer tools at Microsoft, actually. Luke knows this. He was the PM for the F# programming language many years ago, and then I also wore that title for several years. And eventually moved over to Honeycomb, which is a startup in the observability space. And with that kind of came a total shift into like cloud native concerns and understanding like what systems are doing when they're live and how that's very different from perhaps your own mental model of how they should be performing, and realizing that like there's sort of this big change going on in the industry right now as people are realizing that you can't just run something on your own machine, and with that comes sort of these really big needs around often sophisticated tools and ways to gather information about them. And because it's inherently a data analysis space, it's a great fit for a lot of machine learning concerns, including Gen AI. So I've dipped my toes in that quite a bit over the past year and a half. Actually, no, 2 years now. Geez, time has flown.
Great. And then last but not least, Megan.
Thanks, Luke. So I'm a product manager at Pulumi today. Been working in the cloud space on developer tools, or in the cloud space for developers, for the last 5 years. But before that, like within the 4 years before that, I was working on a software engineering team that actually started out such a small startup that we built on a server directly in our office, and was part of the scaling challenges of that, to then purchasing additional servers in a data center, to moving to AWS, and then eventually to GCP. And so I think I got to see firsthand just how much impact cloud tools can have on your development velocity and how that scales over time. And so that's when I kind of got the itch and got interested in the space, and then moved over to being a PM at AWS for a couple years. And then 3 years ago, moved to Pulumi. And at Pulumi, kind of in regards to what we're working on now, we have in the last few years been similar to what Philip was talking about. Like Pulumi, there's a lot of advantages to using these new AI tools and generative AI. And so we've been starting to address customer pain points in that route and extend some of our features using AI, which has been really exciting.
Awesome. Well, lots of good perspectives, and maybe time with that to kind of dive into the AI discussion. So maybe the starting point is just kind of tell me more about how each of you is sort of applying AI concretely into products that you're building, and kind of what exciting things kind of you are doing inside the products you're building with AI today. And Claire, maybe I'll ask you to start this one off.
Yeah, so the product I work on, Q Developer, is generative AI coding and cloud assistant. So it can help you to generate inline code completions in your IDE to help you write code faster. You can chat about your code. You can chat about AWS, ask it questions about your AWS resources or just general AWS topics. We recently have been at the top of the most popular benchmark for coding agents called SweBench. We have a feature called Q Agent for Software Development, where you can give it any kind of a development task, like go add an API that does such and such to this code base, and it comes up with all the code changes you need for you. And we're currently one of the state-of-the-art implementations for that. So that's been really exciting to go from kind of where we started with generative AI doing just inline code completions, really, really latency sensitive, small changes, all the way up to longer running agents that are doing super powerful things with the underlying models. So really just kind of across the board, using generative AI everywhere we can for developers.
Yep, amazing. Maybe Philip.
Yeah, so doing the typical PM thing, late in 2022, I wrote up a little framing doc. This is a couple weeks before ChatGPT launched. Prior to that, I'd been using Copilot a lot in like its early access periods, and really sort of saw like, okay, not only is this cool right now, but there's so many interesting places that you can take like a probabilistic experience when it comes to any kind of analytical work or programming work in general. And I realized that when I tried using it in a non-code based context, and it still worked. It was generating like docs from Markdown and stuff, and it was kind of crappy, but like I could clearly see the trajectory of this kind of stuff. So I wrote up a little document saying, hey, well, observability is a really big part of what developers have to deal with in the cloud native space, and like very often people don't know what question they need to ask of their data, or they know what they care about, but they don't necessarily know how to express it effectively in whatever like querying system they're using, whether it's like Honeycomb specifically, or Splunk, or Datadog, or the myriad of other tools that all have different querying languages and like particular ways you have to query to get certain kinds of data and like then interpret that data in a particular way. And so pretty quickly found there were opportunities around just like simply natural language to query generation, and saw like a lot of traction with that, especially with our new users who were not familiar with our interface, but like knew they could explain using English like what they were actually after. And then started exploring kind of on the opposite end of that, like, hey, how can we start to interpret the results of what you're seeing and help you draw conclusions from that? Because sometimes the conclusion is that like the chart that you're looking at doesn't tell you anything, but you might want to go and explore something else in some other area. And some people who have been using observability tools for a long time, like kind of intuitively know this, but as more and more developers are starting to have to do observability like that mindset and sort of understanding that sometimes you zoom in, sometimes you zoom out, and it really sort of depends on what you're seeing, is not intuitive and like not familiar with them. And so having AI assistance with that can like really help up level these people to the point where then sometimes they don't even need the AI tools anymore because they know how to use this pretty effectively. And so that's what we've been focusing on right now. And then also just sort of combating the general thought of like, hey, what if we could find ways to automate SREs? And I'm like, that's like the final boss for AI. Don't try to fight that dragon right now. There's many other lower hanging fruit that are probably more worthwhile. And
maybe we'll come back to that topic later. I do like how already sort of this is covering kind of a wide spectrum. It's not just the code authoring, it's sort of a lot of different parts of the spectrum of kind of where cloud development takes place. So exciting to see that. Gary, do you want to talk about kind of things at Docker?
Yeah. So we've organized our work in kind of 3 different work streams. So we've been investigating and looking at how we can integrate this into our products. So basically one initiative is focused on how we make our products smarter. And a lot of that is showing up in product with recommendations, for example, to improve experiences around Docker files, improve experiences around Compose files, help automate and resolve troubleshooting issues. So it's, we have one way in which this is showing up. We've been part of GitHub Copilot's extension program, and they have a private preview that's going on right now. That's been pretty successful for us. I think we're the most actively used extension there. That will be launching into market relatively soon. So that's one way in which that's showing up, and we'll look to leverage that into other parts of our product portfolio. Second initiative for us is kind of loosely what we call fix and shovel. So we recognize our tools are being used broadly by a variety of personas to solve, Gen AI related problems, everything from ML engineers and data scientists all the way to software engineers that are looking to integrate, existing APIs into the applications that they're developing. In that, we've uncovered that, there's some challenges that come with all the different components that they have to work with, from the sizes of the models that they're dealing with to the hardware dependencies that they have, and the workflows that are around that. So they're running into limitations around resources that are available locally on the laptop. And part of that for us is understanding how we facilitate offloading that workload to the cloud, where you can take advantage of, the GPUs that we all wish we had under our desk, but maybe we can't afford or wouldn't otherwise want to power at home. So that is broadly like a picks and shovels initiative. And we have a number of partnerships that we're also exploring with that too, working pretty closely with NVIDIA and their Workbench tool. So right now, if you go and download Workbench and you want to do some container-based workflows, or the seamless installation around Docker Desktop that we partnered up with them on. And then the third initiative for us is running out of Docker Labs. And this is about experimenting with different types of tooling that could be improved in the developer lifecycle. So for example, we're playing around with, how we can improve linting, recommendations that we can make around, different phases of the interludes of development. And these are all just small tools that are open source, available on GitHub, just, playing around and seeing what kind of feedback we get, and where we start to see some traction. One, for us to learn a little bit better, but two, also to see where there's interest from developers. So these three initiatives kind of spread across our product development team, where we have our focus right now for Gen AI.
Great. And Megan, how about Pulumi?
Yeah, so how we're using AI within Pulumi, and one thing that's kind of unique about our product space is we just have a large amount of surface area. If you're a user of Pulumi, you could one day be trying to create a VPC in AWS and then in Python, and then the next day, if your team utilizes multiple languages with Pulumi, you could be using Azure or Cloudflare in Python or in TypeScript or something. And so you want to have great examples. We as a company want to have great examples for all of our customer use cases, but our surface area is just extremely broad. And so one of the first use cases of Gen AI for us was we released this tool called PulumiUP, where you can basically just natural language ask for any of these examples. And it really allowed us to leapfrog in terms of documentation and authoring content examples. And immediately we saw great usage of that, but also just the sentiment from users around getting started with Pulumi, being able to go from 0 to 1 with Pulumi was basically like overnight changed. And so that was really, really exciting. And then from there, because that was April 2023, so last year, April, from there, we've kind of seen our customers pull us in a couple of directions. One is just advancing in that code generation avenue, but more towards, I wanted to understand my organization's context. So, this is great that you gave me this example of VPC code, but someone else in my company said we do VPCs this other way. And so now we have two examples that aren't consistent. And so being able to use the context of the rest of your Pulumi code base and things like that. But another area is like in the assistant realm, which a few of you have already talked about, and is especially relevant with Amazon Q, which is we have something we released earlier this year called Pulumi Copilot, where you can go in and say, hey, do I have any environments that have GitHub in them, for example, or who are my admins in Pulumi? And a lot of these I need something done really quickly, and I just want to get to the answer right away. Use cases. And where we've seen customers pull us in from that angle is I'm debugging a deployment. And so I want to go figure out, all right, why did this fail? What do I need to do? And so kind of handhold me through this process because there are a lot of layers to debug. And so that's kind of what's been unique about using these tools within Pulumi.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for those backgrounds. Maybe I'll dive now into sort of some maybe slightly more kind of controversial topics where we can kind of get some differing opinions and things. And I won't necessarily direct these to everyone. Feel free to jump in if you have thoughts on these. But one that I think I've talked to a few folks about. All of you here are building really interesting kind of vertical experiences around kind of AI tooling. And yet we sort of still see that when, I've seen some surveys of developers and things, the tool that folks still use the most, the developers still use the most for supporting their work with AI is still ChatGPT and equivalents to ChatGPT of just sort of the raw models, just conversational chat. I guess a couple of questions to just throw out there. Why do folks think that that is the case today? And do you think that's going to change over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months as we kind of continue to go further in terms of product development?
I could go first.
Okay, go for it.
I think, broadly speaking, lots of people built little chat apps within their own thing and does some form of retrieval on something. Usually it's not much better than ChatGPT anyways. And ChatGPT is a better chat app than probably what you have time to build compared to what a dedicated team in OpenAI does, and has certainly had a lot of lead time in building a really effective multi-purpose chat app. What I think that also speaks towards is a need for those of us who are not at OpenAI to not necessarily try to create the same kind of experience that OpenAI creates for their main consumer app. But really focus on, okay, well, are there other modalities outside of chat where this technology is very leverageable on unique data and context that we have and things that we can give people, where maybe they don't have to ask for something, but maybe you can proactively generate certain things that are jumping off points for certain stuff. And maybe within that, chat becomes a thing that you bring in, but it's maybe not necessarily the starting point. I think we're all collectively as an industry poking around and figuring out what works for each of us, and it's kind of going to be different from product to product. I think where that stands right now is for a lot of software developers, they're okay, cool. Well, XYZ products from all these different companies that I'm using are still figuring out the best possible AI developer experiences for their part of my workflow. If it's not ready yet, I'm just going to use ChatGPT because I know that, and everybody I know knows that, and I will use the thing that is better for that purpose when it's available. And I think I think perhaps to our credit, we do see some of that for sure, but this is a very evolving space, and so it's I don't know. I also think it's the most fleshed out AI tool in existence right now, and so that's why I also use it for the majority of my tasks. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, I'll jump in just quickly. Totally agree with Philip's sentiment around the moat that they have, and how we thought about things at Pulumi is we don't want to replace ChatGPT within our product. That's not helpful for anyone. But what moat do we have? What is the thing that we can offer? And Philip was saying, what's the context that we have in addition? So with Plumi AI, that started out with prompting it with our version, the latest versions of the providers. So there's a lot better quality. But with Plumi Copilot, actually using the user's authenticated session. So you can get information that's direct from their environment. And so I imagine similar things in the space of creating, doing the data analysis stuff, having access to the schema is way more valuable than trying to tell ChatGPT, hey, this is my schema, help me with this query. And so things like that, I completely agree. On the consumer side of things, thinking about myself, why I don't ever use, because I use ChatGPT for absolutely everything, is I value so much all my conversation history. I have threads that have been running for over a year that I enjoy keeping. For example, every week I have a thread of this is what our launches this week are at Pulumi, and it knows all my formats that I need to post across everything, and all I have to do is say this launch happened, this one got delayed, and it updates everything for me. And so that conversation history is the moat for me. And then now memory is a big one. When I interact with ChatGPT, it knows what languages I like. It knows the restrictions on my local hardware, because I often run into issues with that. It knows what I prefer for I use GitHub Desktop like no other engineer ever. And so it gives me my Git debug commands in a UI instruction instead of Git commands. And so all of that memory, yeah, I could copy and paste it into another tool. That's the moat for me today, is I have all of this kind of existing things to make my life easier.
We do see kind of when people start using generative AI chat, they kind of treat it as a search engine, right? It's like a better search engine. And we see that a lot with people coming into like Q developer chat in the AWS console. It's kind of sometimes it's a jumping off point for them to kind of dive deeper. And then I echo the concept of like we have access to APIs or to more tools that are maybe more specific. And so when we show them, hey, you can actually ask about the and EC2 instance status, it's kind of, whoa, that's way more than I can do with search in Google or just general chat. So it's kind of interesting to see the change in how people think about chat as a tool for themselves beyond kind of that initial, just thinking of it as like a more powerful search.
I think that there's also like an acclimation process around like different types of experiences. So one of the areas that we've been investigating is understanding how to make inline recommendations or inline suggestions, and these are unprompted, right? These can be based off of user actions or error conditions or byproducts of like actions that they've taken, and it's not a prompted experience, but that the user has like Claire was saying, it's not a search-based experience where you go in and you're like basically effectively asking ChatGPT instead of asking Google your question, and the results around that are pretty interesting from a product perspective to understand like one. What is the user's engagement? How often do they follow the recommendations? How accurate are the recommendations to actually solve the problem in context? I think to Megan's point, like one of the ways that the in-product experience can be differentiated from more generic Chat GPT or even Copilot experience is a context that you can provide, and that context is not necessarily linked to the immediate context of like where Copilot might be integrated, but also the broader context of their account. Where they're authenticated in other sessions elsewhere, and being able to leverage that to make more effective recommendations. That's one of the things that we're actively exploring right now. So it's I'd say it's a lot more exploratory, or just like it's earlier stage in understanding what those experiences could look like, and then for the end user to become acclimated to those types of experiences. Whereas we're all used to chat in some way, shape, or form, whether it's like interrogative because of our Google experience or because we're constantly texting everyone that we interact with, right? So
yeah, I think it's a good jumping up point for kind of another direction of questions, which sort of just whether it's in work that you're doing yourself and with your teams, or work that you've seen somewhere else, either in research or in other kind of products in the ecosystem. Curious if folks have things that they see that they're really exciting advances that they're seeing in kind of pushing forward the boundaries of what's possible for applying AI to cloud development, whether it's from a user interaction model perspective, or it's a new application of sort of new models and new technologies that are more fundamental. Kind of curious if anyone has examples of things they're seeing that they're really excited about, seeing how those scale up to real world scenarios.
Well, one that I'm really interested in these days is the interaction model of generative AI experiences has largely been synchronous so far. It's been the chat. It's been click a button and get a recommendation. But I'm more and more interested these days in asynchronous interactions where I can have an agent go off for even hours and bring me back something that's much more useful to me maybe than a synchronous result. And so, I talked earlier about going off and creating a large code change with our software development agent. That's kind of just one example of this idea of asynchronous agents, and I see them popping up quite a bit, at least in the coding space. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about other spaces, but this idea that you can kind of have it spin for a while and come back with something that is super useful while you go off and have a coffee or do something else during your day.
This is almost like a very in the weeds sort of excitement thing, but like I'm really, really interested in inference in general, like all of the incredible trade-offs that you have to make. And it's a very active research space now as well. But like it really comes down to just the constraints on resources that we have. And, over time, users just expect things to be like faster and more correct and all of that. And there's all these things where like, well, we can be more correct, but we're going to be way slower if we do that. And there's circumstances where that's totally fine and totally expected. And then other circumstances where they're like, but I want the thing right now. And like, I feel like it's moving towards a direction where it doesn't really have to be an either or. Just like you can go and read about it, like the myriad of techniques that are sort of coming out and to make inference, not just like 25% faster or 50% faster, but like 500 times faster. Like things that I thought were fast when GPT 3.5 got like a speed boost are like ridiculously slow these days. And that just opens up so many possibilities of like, okay, well, instead of generating like one possible outcome, what if we can generate 50 of them all in parallel and then run like another process that like sweeps through them all and like sort of judges them and like in the time span that it would have taken just doing like one possible thing that could have veered off in a bad direction. And I think like that will just make things much more accurate and much more usable in the long run for us. And like it's fast evolving, so it's kind of hard to keep up with, but I'm really excited about it.
Might not even have time to finish that coffee before the agent is done, right?
Well, for some tasks, it'll still, rightfully so, it probably will take plenty of time. And I think that like that's good that we could eventually be in a world where like we can have really powerful stuff chugging along asynchronously and like it's like, wow, this whole thing was done for me. But then like when I also expect something to be fast, it's not just gonna be like baby stuff. Like it can actually be like fairly substantial.
One thing that stood out to me recently, I met with a startup that is looking to apply Gen AI to pen testing. And pen testing has been kind of primarily the space of like, it's required a niche expertise. It's been a very, human in the loop manual process. And there's some tooling around it, but, the application of Gen AI to that, I think is pretty interesting. Like they're aiming for a kind of a factor of like 20x reduction of human in the loop. And I think what was exciting to me about that story was, there's clearly lots of code being generated with Gen AI today. It will become more secure over time, but this is like, it's an escalation of the cat and mouse game between like, red teams and blue teams. And the extent to which this pen test automation can show up in like, CI and CD, I think creates like really interesting opportunities for how we can all ship like more secure and trustworthy applications. So I found that to be like just non-obvious, but really interesting sort of application of Gen AI to improve like the quality of applications that we all end up shipping.
Yeah, I love that, expanding the sort of different parts of the life cycle even further out. So that's great.
My kind of area that I'm excited for is much less in the weeds as some of yours, which is like I really enjoy using this tool Vercel has, which is like v0.dev, where you just kind of say like, hey, we're building this new page and it needs to have this functionality, and it just gives you like the front end code for it. And it just allows for like really quick iteration and internal discussion. And I'm really excited as a PM for tools like that just allow us to go through ideation a lot quicker, where we can just say, I imagine that Figma is building things like this. So we can just say like, hey, I need a wireframe, take this existing, high fidelity design of our dashboard and then add these 3 cards and do this, and then just have it there. And it's interesting thinking about like where that leads. This week I was listening to a podcast talking about like the bank teller phenomenon when ATMs were released, which I had never heard of because probably I'm too young. But basically like everyone thought they would get rid of bank tellers when they added ATMs to every branch, but it actually increased the amount of bank teller jobs because then it became more like feasible, like in terms of cost, to open more bank branches because you were paying less tellers. So the number of tellers per branch went down, but the number of total tellers went up because they opened more branches because it was more economical to do so. And so it just had me thinking about like, what is that for us in terms of like, can we have less engineers per feature, but deliver more features for like the same feasibility? And I'm really excited about those advancements that make it easier for us to iterate, develop features quicker, like deliver value to customers faster, and increase our product space with like the same amount of people.
I am really excited about the ability to create more prototypes. Similar in ideation, like we create wireframes and you kind of get a sense from it what you like, but you don't always know what you want to build until you see it. There was this really great quote, a random blog post by a guy named Lawrence Tratt, who does research in software development. And he said software has a circular specification problem where we almost have to entirely build the software before we realize what we actually wanted to build. And that like generative AI, I think, has a real power for it to actually build real working software. Even if it's not exactly what we wanted to build, it helps us to learn what it is we actually want to build. And then we kind of take it from there as engineers. And so I think the clarity we'll be able to get so quickly, and with these super rapid prototypes that take months to build today with real software, is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great segue in. Things like v0.dev, have these sort of amazing experiences, but obviously to that point, that both Claire and Megan you were making, they're focused around the front end kind of development experience primarily, or even the design, with tools from the sort of design vendors. When we look at sort of the cloud development piece, it feels like things get a bit harder, right? It's a little bit harder to do this end-to-end. It's a little bit harder to build out all the infrastructure and all the different pieces. They're sort of really full stack in a deeper sense. Why is it that, what do you feel is different around building tools that sort of go all the way through the stack into kind of the cloud development side? And why is it maybe more difficult, or is it actually more difficult to kind of see through that part of the stack as well?
I think today it's more difficult to visualize a distributed system. As something as, oh yes, that's how it should be working. That's what I want. Whereas a front end, you can, it's very tactile. You can play with it. You can see it. I think that prototyping distributed systems is something that is going to be just as valuable as sort of prototyping front ends. Today, we kind of do whiteboard drawings, right? It's like the equivalent of maybe a Figma drawing, but I think that, but again, it takes so long to actually build like a prototype distributed system that you end up building the real thing. But I think generative AI will potentially let us generate these distributed systems, and it might not be exactly what we wanted, but I think the challenge is, how do you present it to the user? What's the user experience around helping them to see what they want and what they don't want in this distributed system design?
I also think there's a level of consequences for failure that can sometimes be a lot higher. It's not always going to be higher. But like, I'm thinking about at Honeycomb earlier this year, we rolled out this feature. Like it launched finally. It was basically like 2 years in development. And like the code for it was like active for those 2 years, sort of behind every request that anybody was using, because it was a fundamental change to how we organized data in our query engine, and like allowed you to sort of pull segments of it and combine them in different ways. And there were like just a massive pile of assumptions that had built up in sort of this first version of Honeycomb's backend that were now, oh, we need to wipe that one out, and that one out, and like totally reorient how the thing works. And like, on one hand, I think it would be amazing if we could have had almost sort of like feature flagging across different variations of different approaches that we could try at the same time. However, in the course of just doing it with like this one variation behind one feature flag with things that were like not, activated from an end user's perspective, we generated like 4 or 5 incidents, and one of them actually like took down our entire backend at one point. And so like, this is very real consequences for that sort of failing. And I think that also creates a high bar for experimentation in that regard. Like, we're lucky in that we can deploy very, very quickly. We have really good observability that like we can tell if something is wrong and why it might be going wrong, and like really good engineers who had a lot of experience to sort of understand, okay, well, I can almost sort of anticipate where this might fail, and I'll know what to do. I know what to do when that failure ultimately happens. That's not going to be the case even across a single company, let alone our industry at large. And so I think like that, what that speaks towards is like less, hey, the AI needs to be better, but like there's a whole other set of cloud development practices that people need to level up on. And I mean, if AI can help assist with that in some way, that's great. But that's the thing that like I would totally would have loved to use AI to experiment with this thing that we were doing for literally 2 straight years. Like, talk about opportunities for experimentation, right? But at the same time, certainly with today's technology, I don't think it would have actually worked, because there would have been too many incidents that we would have created and said, okay, we got to turn this thing off.
Maybe I'll share an observation around this I find like kind of interesting, right? So I think a lot of the larger, more complex applications that we see developed are relatively bespoke. And so if you have like a more cynical view on Gen AI as like effectively offering like super autocomplete, it's really hard to have like the right base of basically like reference material to make the right recommendations, because of how the bespoke nature of a lot of these custom applications, or the complexity of the applications that are involved. And it's interesting. So like, yeah, there are some common patterns, right? Well-known patterns that can be recommended, but like as you get more specialized in what you're trying to accomplish, they become less relevant or less translatable to achieve the outcomes that you want. And I think that presents an interesting risk, right? So, V0 by Vercel was mentioned. If you've taken a look at like the recent stuff from Replit with Replit agents, there's real potential, and depending on the type of business you're in, maybe it's a risk that like a next generation PaaS is going to abstract away a lot of the complexity that, on maybe a lot of toil that developers deal with today, in the bespoke nature of like how many of these applications are defined. Like we spent a lot of time with customers trying to understand, for example, how they configure like their Kubernetes deployments. How are they designing and developing those applications? And there's some patterns and some overlap, but it tends to be relatively bespoke. And so I do think this creates an opportunity for companies to look at, if you can go directly from, the generation of the application to deployment without having to fuss with the complexity of the distributed backend nature of the application, you can rely on a PaaS to do that for you. We will probably see a huge explosion in the number of applications or number of features, but it may also threaten, some business models that are out there. So I think it's an interesting opportunity. It certainly is great for lots of product managers to get to get things out faster. That's for sure.
Definitely. Well, maybe that's the kind of product manager angle is maybe a transition into another topic here, which is sort of, we talked a lot about some of the what's, like what are the exciting technologies and what are we all doing with them. I'm kind of curious a little bit, since everyone here has been actively involved in building these kind of systems, what is it that ends up being different about the how you end up approaching kind of building products, designing products around these AI and Gen AI technologies? How is it different than kind of your experience building traditional kind of developer tooling product experiences? And what's different? What's better? What's maybe harder or worse?
I can maybe start on this one. Yeah, I think one thing that's been interesting from my angle building these tools is like there's not a lot of prior art, right? Like we're all kind of just making up what these interaction models are. And so it's interesting, like Philip at Honeycomb, when they released their query editor, like I remember going there and being like, how did they figure this out? Like going from natural language straight to having these results, because there's this interaction model of like, you want to be able to have the query generated for you, but you also want to be able to edit it if you just know how to fix it in that syntax versus having to rewrite your whole prompt. And like, just these interaction models are just very new. And like, one of the things we were just talking about is like, how do you make this cloud and like distributed systems dev loop quicker and like prototype faster? Like one thing that I think Amazon Q has done really well is like they give you a list of like instructions, like almost like I think it's called a plan, like every step I'm going to take. It's like, I'm going to go create this API. I'm going to change the name of this, like each of these detailed things. And like that, you guys probably just invented that, right? There was no prior art for like, hey, I'm about to perform all these actions on your behalf. Before I go do that, how do you want to audit this? It's kind of what Gary was saying about reference material. Like, how do you get the user to kind of okay before we go spend all this time and get so far down the track and be, the wrong route? So I think for us, it was interesting figuring out like, okay, how do we give the user enough information that they can debug it themselves? And so in our use case of making API calls on the user's behalf in Pulumi Copilot, we actually show the API calls in like this thing you can open expand, kind of similar to how if ChatGPT does data analysis, it shows you the code itself. So you could say like, oh, use the wrong API, or like you can kind of fix some of these small like hallucination or queer things yourself. And that was kind of hard to figure out originally because you want it to feel like magic. You want the user to be like, I asked for something and it happened, but you have to give them the tools to fix it in a way that you don't in most features, right? If they were just going to do a search and had to write their own syntax, you wouldn't be like going through this iteration of like, how do I tell them when we make a mistake? And so it's like a different type of product interaction when you have to give them enough tools for it to be valuable. So that's one piece that I thought was different, and we kind of took us a while to figure out.
And it's more difficult to tell how you're doing once it's all in production, right? It's non-deterministic. So previously, we would look at like API success rate, like are we returning 200s or 500 status codes? And now, even though we might return you a response successfully, it may not be the response that was most useful to you. And so we start to look at very different metrics for how we're doing and evaluating the product than we did before.
Yeah, very very similar boat for us. Like we ran an experiment that is live in production for us now with our docs. So our docs website now has like an agent where you can go query and get pretty valuable responses. But we didn't figure out that they were pretty valuable until we actually started to ask the users. And so getting that type of feedback and that feedback loop, I think, is pretty essential. The other thing that I think has changed for us is how we look at data, right? So, data has always been essential for us to understand, adoption, success, like basically how well is the customer having their problem solved by our products. But now we have to sort of have a broader view on data to sort of a broader view on the context in which they're trying to do their work. But then two, like really trying to understand what data we need to augment the recommendations that we're making, right? And that, I think, we're having to reevaluate that across all of our products. And there's a lot that we're learning in that process, right? I don't think that is a solved problem quite yet for us, and I think for a lot of companies right now.
I can just briefly sort of mention that. I mean, since I work for an observability company, my answer is a little bit biased, but like part of the solution to this is actually taking observability seriously. Like from the user inputs perspective, you hand them this tool. You cannot possibly predict the things that they're going to want to try to do with it and what the inputs are going to be. And for any given input, you very often cannot possibly predict what the output is going to be. And so it's like, all right, cool. Like, screw guesswork. We're not going to try to anticipate things. I mean, you might be able to anticipate a few things. There's often sort of like a Pareto distribution of classes of problems that people want to solve. But even within that, there can be some substantial variation. You have to look at the data, and you have to be like deploying stuff all the time, looking at things and continuously improving, like really practicing back to the whole DevOps mentality of continuous deployment, continuous integration, like really taking that whole workflow seriously, which I think like cloud development engineers in particular have been saying, hey, this is really important all the time. And I think Gen AI, when you're trying to build effective Gen AI products, really just turns the dial up on that substantially, because you can't just debug this thing on your local machine in a way that's any way similar to what this random customer has and this random customer has and all that. And I don't think it's the full solution to it, but taking your questions about how is this doing and how can we improve it, and quantifying that with data and running experiments on that kind of stuff is sort of the key to unlocking success here. I think a lot of software developers are starting to realize that as they're dipping their toes into this stuff and being like, wow, my old tool set for doing development is just not cutting it.
Awesome. Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to ask kind of one last question to everyone to kind of just get some thinking outside of the box of the sort of near-term timeframes. So kind of curious to just pose to everyone kind of, what do you think of as one prediction you would make for kind of the next few years of this space that is potentially controversial or might be surprising that you think is going to come true in the next few years? Anyone want to kick us off with that?
I hope I don't have to write a shell script for the next 2 years. Tool use directly by models is improving so much, and their ability to just kind of go off and make a plan and execute on it. Hopefully that becomes safer to do, but that's basically what I'm doing when I write a shell script. So I hope that, in the future, scripting is mostly writing a prompt and letting the model handle it.
I predict, I guess this is maybe more than like 5 to 10 year horizon or so. Similar to how like 10 years ago, certain kinds of companies were much more leveraged in terms of utilizing the cloud effectively than other companies. And like that really bore out in terms of financial success. I think the exact same dynamic is going to happen with AI. Some organizations that did a better job of collecting and curating useful information and useful context that they can connect up with various things will catapult them above their competition compared to competitors who may have like not collected useful data in some capacity, or like don't really have a way to connect the pipes from A to B and like feed that into a model somehow. And I think it's kind of hard to tell like who those companies might be. But I think like from a retrospective standpoint, 5 to 10 years from now, we could look back and like that'll probably be one of the leading indicators of broader market success.
I'll offer one up. I think there's chatter around that, the rate of improvement may be slowing down. Although, Philip offered an interesting data point about like, opportunities around inference. I think that progress is going to continue to be nonlinear for a while. I think it's so early right now that things will appear to be slowing down, and then we'll have a significant leap forward, and then maybe things will slow down or speed up. But it's going to be nonlinear, which makes it really difficult to answer your question about the types of predictions. But what Megan said really resonated with me about the prospect of having fewer developers per feature and effectively more features. I think we'll similarly see like an explosion of applications and companies around those applications, and there will be a tremendous diversity for people to choose from, because the entry cost will have come down pretty dramatically. And so the question is, then how do you like differentiate yourself from all that noise? And I think what I'm excited about is not just like the synchronous experiences, but I think this was mentioned earlier, like what can Gen AI be doing for us in the background to like really enable us to be more productive, more efficient, and get to focus on the things that really matter, as opposed to like the busy work that we all wish we could, not have to spend any time on. So I'm pretty bullish on this. I'm excited.
Great. Megan.
I'll try and keep mine pretty succinct. I think, I'm skeptical that in the 2-year time mark that any like enterprise SaaS AI features will be like what delivers core functionality to your users. I think that it is not a key value driver. It is an extension on your existing product. And so having your core product be really good and then use these tools to make it better, easier to use, faster to learn, things like that are great. But I don't see it like paving over us building great products and being able to ship like bottoms up with that. It's really just an extension of it. It's my prediction
Awesome.
in the next 2 years.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining today. It's been a really fun discussion representing lots of different kind of data points around the spectrum of building tools in this space. And thanks, everyone. And we'll see you soon.